Since the dawn of time, man has been striving for immortality and looking for ways to leave his mark on the world. In the beginning was drawing. Only the hand, the eye's instrument, could save the moment. We only knew the world through artists' interpretations. But in the first half of the 19th century, the inventions came thick and fast. Engines, metal bridges, and railroads. Meanwhile, chemists, scientists, and enthusiastic amateurs were determined to reproduce reality with a machine, the image-making machine. Photography, writing with light, soon became a universal language.
What is interesting is, why did the invention occur at that time? They were people who were looking for an invention which would combine both art and science.
Nicéphore Niepce, a mechanics enthusiast, began experimenting with the photographic process as early as 1816. His first known attempt was in 1822. 4 years later, he obtained this picture by exposing in a dark room facing his courtyard a plate of tin coated with bitumen. The picture was rediscovered 130 years later in an attic in London.
Niepce became associated with a Parisian dandy called Daguerre, who, after Niepce's death, created what he modestly called the daguerreotype, which was a remarkably sharp photograph on a silver plate, which nonetheless had several defects. First of all, it was unique. There was no negative. It was hard to view it. You needed a reflection and to look at it from an angle of incidence. So to a certain extent, it was a dead end.
Daguerre created the diorama, a spectacle of optical illusions which fascinated Paris during the Louis-Philippe era. He improved the darkroom and above all discovered the notion of development. His first plates were still lifes as their immobility enabled long exposure times. He then went out into the carriage-filled streets of Paris. If the boulevard is empty, it's because the passers-by and carriages were moving too fast to be captured by the camera. Only the motionless man who's having his shoes polished is visible. He's the first living person to appear in a photograph.
There was also a rather unusual character called Hippolyte Bayard, who was an ordinary civil servant at the Ministry of Finance. He was an art lover like many people in those days. By January 1839, he'd heard of Daguerre's first experiments. He started work sometime in February. Here we see the fruit of his experiments, the progressive appearance of pictures which he carefully recorded in a notebook. We can see that by March he had managed to make positive pictures on paper. So it still wasn't photography as we know it today. It's rather like a daguerreotype, but on paper. This is only natural because Bayard had an artistic nature close to that of a painter, so he was more interested in paper than silver plates.
Daguerre's work was better received than Bayard's. On August 19, 1839, the Member of Parliament Arago announced that France could offer the world the secret of photography. Everyone was ecstatic, and the invention was at once a huge success.
Faced with a wall of silence from the authorities, Bayard took photographs of himself. This is one of the first self-portraits in history. Indeed, Bayard was often there first. He took pictures of himself as a drowned man, as a corpse on a chair, and on the back he said to have written,
"The corpse of the man you see on the other side is that of Mr. Bayard, inventor of the process whose wonderful results you've just seen." The government, which has given far too much to Mr. Daguerre, said it was unable to help Mr. Bayard, and the unlucky man drowned himself. In England, Fox Talbot, an aristocrat, Egyptologist, and chemist, began his experiments in 1834. Flowers, leaves, transparent subjects painted on glass were superimposed on light-sensitive paper. These photogenic drawings, as he called them, are fixed in a sea salt solution. These experiments led to the discovery of the calotype in 1840, a process which enabled him to make multiple positives from a single negative. From the Greek kalos, meaning beauty, the calotype is the forerunner of all modern photography.
Niepce de Saint-Victor, who was a distant cousin of Nicéphore Niepce, continued his forebear's work. He had the idea of removing the paper which was used as the negative and which, due to the very texture of the paper, produced rather grainy, blurred negatives, as we can see if we look at those calotypes. His idea was to do away with the paper and use a sheet of glass, a much sharper medium.
To fix the silver halide on this sheet of glass, Niepce de Saint-Victor used starch, then albumin, a process which became common in 1851. Millions of eggs had to be broken to use the whites.
Niepce in particular, and Daguerre also, were interested in making machines that they could patent and which they could make money out of. So it was a sort of technological innovation. But in fact, the material technology of photography had really existed for a long time before then.
The optical principles of the camera obscura had already enabled the Greek philosopher Aristotle to study a solar eclipse. The Arab scholar Alhazen used them in astronomy. They can also be found in Leonardo da Vinci's writings. In 1589, the Italian physician Giovanni Battista Porta added a lens to the device, and as early as 1761, Tipaigne de la Roche, in one of his books, predicted the advent of photography.
In Europe and the Middle East, pioneers set off to bring back images that people had never seen before, such as Maxime Ducamp, who went to Egypt.
The daguerreotype gave people access to the world of pictures, but very soon the calotype, which was lighter and more manageable, let explorers become photographers. There was a great interest in exotica at the time. Young people had a great urge to learn about far-off places and cultures. Bonaparte and the writer Chateaubriand led the way. The first destinations were the Orient, these mystical places that people only knew through stories and engravings. In the desert, the heat was unbearable, and the wet plates dried too quickly. And the dry collodion process, invented by the painter Legray, had a tendency to boil. Maxime Ducamp, accompanied by novelist Gustave Flaubert, followed in the footsteps of Jean-François Champollion, the French Egyptologist. They went as far as the Second Cataract of the Nile, whose source was still a mystery. Legend has it that when Flaubert was asked, "What did the temples at Abu Simbel inspire in you?" he said, "It's where I came up with the name of Emma for Madame Bovary." Archaeological descriptions of the Mediterranean Orient encouraged photographers to set off in search of fresh pastures. If the desert heat caused the collodion to boil, the cold of the mountains froze it. It had to be warmed up with alcohol stoves. This is what the Bisson brothers did during the ascent of the Mont Blanc with Napoleon III and Empress Eugénie. The Japanese had a passion for painted photos. To them, it was an art form in itself. Photographers also had a taste for adventure on the high seas. The waves in Legray's photos are reminiscent of Courbet's paintings.
In the United States, many people set off to record America's heritage, the wide open spaces of the West. There are some extraordinary American landscape photographs.
From 1860 on, the American government organized expeditions to discover new lands. Photographers took part in these topographic and geological missions. For his first voyage in 1861, Watkins traveled with a cart converted into a laboratory and a dozen mules to carry his bulky equipment. He explored Yosemite Valley and its cathedral-like rock formations. Muybridge was also inspired by Yosemite. Jackson went from the Grand Canyon to Yellowstone with over 90 kilos of equipment. All these adventurers portrayed the birth of a nation, having previously been gold diggers in California or painters. Curtis, however, set out to save the memory of a people from being lost as they were being pushed out of the new America. He spent 30 years of his life documenting the Indian tribes of North America. He recorded everything about them, learned about their medicines and sorcery, observed their hunting techniques and their sacred songs. He took over 40,000 photographs and listed about 1,000 languages from the 80 tribes he lived with. He managed to capture the spirit of this strange people. This colossal work shows us the prehistory of the young American nation and is precious ethnographic source material.
The reasons for photography being invented had a lot to do with the invention of printing itself, with lithography. And it was an attempt to make lithography, in effect, a more mechanical medium, a more easily produced, easily reproduced medium.
These illustrations were first presented alongside the text in the form of plates. They all said, "Based on a photograph." Photographers sent pictures from all over the world, complete with captions. Then the photographs were touched up and used in magazines.
The problem, of course, was the technique of photographic reproduction. Photo engraving had not been perfected. When the photos were used in the newspapers, they required extra contrast. That's when the engraving workshop sprang up. The craftsmen who touched up photos and made photographic plates for 30 or 40 years.
The quality of the engraving workshops no doubt delayed the onset of press photography. The end of the century saw a great photographic revolution. George Eastman was a bookkeeper in a Rochester bank by day. By night, he developed a light-sensitive gelatin solution, which he applied by hand to glass plates. In 1880, he changed to dry plate photography, In 1888, he marked his invention, the Kodak, a handheld device fitted with a roll of film that could take 100 pictures. Eastman's idea was simple. The camera should be easy to use as a pen. His first advertising slogan was, "You press the button, we do the rest." Kodak's facilities handled the development and printing of the photos and sent the camera back with a new film in, all for $10. The days of aristocrats being painted were over. Now anyone could be a photographer. Very quickly, the Eastman Kodak Company distributed its cameras all over the world. In 1912, the laboratories tested a new reasonably priced color film. 1, 2, then 3 colors were tried until they settled on the process that is still used today. In his factories, Eastman was experimenting with mass production some 20 years before Henry Ford and his cars. Price was one of Eastman's priorities. Advertising was another. In 1930, to celebrate 50 years of Kodak, he gave every child under 12 a camera. He distributed 500,000 cameras in the United States and Canada. At the end of his life, he took part in a symposium with other influential captains of industry, Thomas Edison, Sir Thomas Lipton, Walter Chrysler, and Henry Ford. The Leitz Company was a family firm based in Wetzlar, Germany, which manufactured microscopes and telescopes. The Leitz engineers were testing the sensitivity of cinema film stock. Like the Lumiere brothers before them, they filmed the factory gates and the workshops. In the 20s, Oscar Barnack ran the Microscopic Research Laboratory. He was trying to develop a smaller, more manageable camera. As luck would have it, he came up with a small camera using film stock, the 24 by 36 format. It combined instant poses with rapid film advance. He took his first photos of a flooded Wetzlar.
Before, they used glass plates with one picture per plate. It was frame by frame. There were no rolls of film with 36 pictures. So it was a boon to reporters. They could now go and work all over the world.
Barnack's camera was introduced to the general public in 1925 under the name Leica, a contraction of lights and camera. The press rejected it at first as they disliked its small format. The invention must have come at the right time, however, because in Berlin, the Rolleiflex appeared, a camera with similar characteristics.
Those two cameras, I think, revolutionized photography because they allowed photographers to work in the street without a studio, without lights, without a tripod. You could walk around and you could take photographs of anything that caught your fancy.
For the first time, photographers could take pictures at eye level. Thanks to their lightweight, manageable design and interchangeable lenses, these cameras led to the birth of a new race of reporter. This was the start of photojournalism.
Newspapers rejected the 24 by 36 format right through to the end of the 30s because they thought it was too small to make blow-ups and print-quality photographs. The most popular camera of the day was the Speed Graphic, which all the great reporters used. That and the 6x6, but any smaller, and photographers had a hard time getting their photos used.
The Speed Graphic is a very interesting camera because it was used very widely by American press photographers. The reason for that was that with one plate in the back, or film pack where you could change the film, you could get a very, very clear image, large 4-inch by 5-inch negative, many times larger than a 35mm camera, for instance. With a flash attached to it, the Speed Graphic could take an image in a large and not very well lit room, and you didn't really need to focus the camera very much. You could just stop the lens right down. In fact, that was the way in which it was mostly used. And then you could enlarge a portion of the image, whichever portion of the image that you decide. And you could use the whole frame of the image or a small portion of the image, and you would get a very usable result.
A famous advocate of the speed graphic was the American photographer Arthur Fellig, known as Ouija. He always had a cigar in his mouth, a camera in his hand, and a story to tell. He was the first photographer to get a permit to use a CB radio. He arrived at the scene of the crime before the police, took his photos back to develop them, and typed up his story. This son of Jewish immigrants had a miserable childhood. Fascinated by street photographers, his days were filled with the murders, fires, suicides, and accidents of New York. This was just after the start of the Great Depression, and the public wanted sensational news stories. And with Ouija, they sure got him.
Now we have a picture. In 10 seconds, we must have counted wrong.
This instant photo system was invented in 1947 by the American Edwin Land, who used polarizing filters from sunglasses. He also created the 3D glasses that Hollywood was so keen on a few years later.
Today will be a turning point in the history of photography. Photography will never again be the same after today.
Just 20 years later, 14 million cameras had been sold.
Artists were very attracted to this. Not just photographic artists, but people like Andy Warhol used the instantness of this image as an element in their own work.
Other artists used this original process, such as André Kertész, who discovered it at the age of 84 and published At My Window, a collection of 50 color Polaroid pictures. There's now a new revolution on the way: digital photography.
Now, the first thing I do is I shoot directly. So the sound you can hear is the direct recording on a computer. Actually, it's a computer incorporated in the camera.
Although digital technology cannot yet rival the quality of traditional film, it's winning over a lot of photographers because it lets them alter the images at will on a computer.
The advent of the digital camera is really a part of a process that's been going on within Western society for a long time, where people will buy products which allow them to do things in the home, which previously they had to go out to other organisations or other services to and buy them in. It's part of a self-servicing process. What will happen, of course, with digital photography is that it eventually will replace taking your film to a high street, into a mini lab, and getting your prints processed and receiving them back. At the moment, the technology isn't particularly advanced, despite what the manufacturers are saying, and the quality isn't very high. But of course, it will become much better in time. So I see digital photography in, say, 20 or 25 years will have replaced a large proportion of silver photography.
Fashion and advertising have embraced the new technology as they don't require faithful representations of reality. With relatively little equipment, you can create strong, sophisticated images. The storage and distribution of photographs are also being revolutionized. Development and processing are becoming things of the past. Photography is surfing the internet, making pictures available to an ever wider audience. Now on the web you can find examples of these 19th century precursors who had already invented so much. The age we live in encourages us to have one eye on the past, the 19th century, in which great artists were at once able to make photography a real art, and the other on the future, the new millennium in which photography is set to become one of the great means of transmitting knowledge via new media.